the Israeli military announced last Thursday that it killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Hamas confirmed his martyrdom on Friday. But what distinguishes Sinwar's death at Israel's hands from those of other major resistance leaders, including Sinwar's predecessors, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh and Hizballah leader Hasan Nasrallah, is that Sinwar was not targeted for assassination. Sinwar died as a fighter armed with his own weapon among his own men in the streets of Gaza. The Israelis did not even know they had killed him last Wednesday until after the fact. The way in which Sinwar died, including the iconic video of his final defiant act of throwing a stick at the Israeli drone filming him as he sat gravely injured in an armchair in a bombed-out apartment, has had a rallying rather than demoralizing effect on the resistance and its supporters. It could not have been further from Israeli claims that Sinwar would be hiding deep underground, shielding himself with Israeli captives. Later in the program, we will watch that incredible video with John Elmer, who's going to give us a detailed look at Yahya Sinwar's life and death during his resistance report. So do stay tuned for that. Western political leaders, meanwhile, put out a series of apparently coordinated statements celebrating Sinwar's death, repeating Israeli atrocity propaganda and lies about October 7th, and demonizing a man who spent 2 decades of his life in an Israeli prison and a whole lifetime struggling for the liberation of his people. US President Joe Biden called Sinwar's killing, quote, a good day for Israel, for the United States, and for the world. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer instructed that, quote, no one should mourn the death of Hamas leader Sinwar, while Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau claimed that Sinwar's death, quote, ends a reign of terror. According to our next guest, we should ignore these calumnies against Sinwar written by his genocidal enemies and listen to Sinwar himself if we want to understand him and his role in the Palestinian struggle. Justin Podur makes these points in an article he wrote for the Electronic Intifada this week titled Yahya Sinwar Wrote His Own Story. Many of our audience will know Justin, but for those who don't, he is the author of Siege Breakers, a 2019 novel in which Palestinians in Gaza win a war of liberation. He runs the Anti-Empire Project podcast and YouTube channel, including the Gaza War Sit-Rep series with several videos on the military situation per week. They are really informative and essential viewing. Justin, we're so glad to have you on the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Hey, Justin.
Hey, guys. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. Just listen to your report, Nora, like I do every week. And I mean, yeah. Okay. Let's get on with it.
All right. Well, thank you, Justin. So the title of your article for the Electronic Intifada can be read both lyrically and literally. Literally, because Yahya Sinwar did, in fact, write his own story in the form of a novel titled The Thorn and the Carnation. It was completed in 2004 and smuggled out of the Israeli prison where Israel had planned for Sinwar to spend the rest of his life. Of course, Sinwar was released in that 2011 prisoner exchange for the Israeli prisoner of war, Gilad Shalit. Before we get deeper into the discussion, can you react to the fact that under Israeli pressure, Amazon banned the sale of Sinwar's book in April, but at the same time, Amazon still allows sales of Hitler's Mein Kampf?
I mean, I have a colleague who co-wrote a book on Venezuela with me, Joe Emmersberger, and he wrote a really well-received review of Mein Kampf, and he was basically like, the surprising thing about Mein Kampf is like that when he read it was how much Hitler worshipped the British Empire and how much Hitler was enamored with both the British and the Americans. Couldn't really understand why they would fight. All he wanted to do was kill communists and Jews who were blamed for communism. So if you understand the continuity of the Israeli project with what's written in that book, there's no reason for the supporters of Israel to ban that book at all. On the other hand, Sinwar's book is a book of resistance to that project. The resistance, Nowadays, Abu Ubaidah always refers to Israel as the Nazi occupation. They make that link now. Since October 7th, I've seen that the resistance is always now, doesn't hesitate to make that link between what Israel is doing and the continuity with Nazi Germany. And between like the German foreign minister basically saying civilians are open season, which again is continuity with German history in World War II and pre-World War II. World War I, they had the same doctrine. They had the same doctrine in Africa, in their African colonies, where they committed a genocide in 1905. So I don't, when you understand that, it's actually not surprising at all that Sinwar would be banned and Mein Kampf would not be.
Well, let's talk more about Sinwar's book. You write that his novel is full of insight into how Sinwar saw the world and the perspective from which he built up the resistance movement. What do you see as the main themes that emerge from the book, and how do they help us understand the current situation in Gaza and the region, and the interplay between armed resistance, politics, and the ultimate goal of liberating Palestine?
That's a great question. Thank you. This is exactly what I wanted to talk about. There was before I did a review of the book for my Substack a little while ago. There was another review on Mondo Weiss by Haneen Odeh-Tallah. I don't know Haneen, but Haneen found several themes in the characters of Sinwar's book, and those three themes that Haneen talked about were self-sacrifice, asceticism, and security awareness. Those were the three things that came through for Haneen in the book. For me, those were definitely present. When you look at the main character of the book, is this a character named Ibrahim. I mean, the point of view character is Ahmed, and he's growing up. And the choice of genre is also important, because I've said before, you could write a horror movie or a horror story with the material that Israel provides every day. You could write, hundreds of horror stories with that material. You could write a romance novel, because there's so much love and care in the way the Palestinians are and treat each other. You could write an adventure, a thriller, a heist. There's all these things you could do. Sinwar's book is a coming of age story, so it's the classic kind of coming of age story. You're watching this character's growing up, and he's watching, and the person that he looks up to is his cousin Ibrahim. And Ibrahim has these three qualities: self-sacrifice, asceticism, and security awareness. But Ibrahim also has a whole bunch of other qualities that I think Sinwar is trying to show readers. These are the important qualities that you have to have if you want to resist, if you want to live a life worth living in this context. So one of them is Ibrahim is a great organizer. He's a campus organizer. He's a business. He has a business. He's a construction. He works hard. He's an example to others. He's good at his job. He studies, all of that. He's a whole package, right? He takes care of his family. You guys may have seen a funny clip where Sinwar, I guess, is on a radio show or something, and someone complains that someone's wife is complaining to the radio host that her husband doesn't pay attention to her when Sinwar is on the radio for whatever reason. And Sinwar says, no, that's wrong. You have to take care of your wife. Your wife is the most important thing. That comes first. And so that's also in this story. You got to take care of your family. You have to take care of your loved ones. You have to do your work. You have to study, and your resistance duties and your religious duties. These are all part of these things. And Ibrahim is the whole package. He's very much moved by the suffering of his people. I quoted the 5-day interview he did with that Italian journalist, Francesca Borri, where he talks about the children who've known nothing but
that's Sinwar's interview.
Yeah, Sinwar's interview. Yeah. So I'm going back and forth between Ibrahim and Sinwar, because let's face it, Ibrahim is Sinwar. He's the character that Sinwar wrote, which is kind of like a stand-in for Sinwar himself. And he says, these kids are wondering what's beyond the wave, and that's what I want. I want their freedom. And Ibrahim, similarly, he goes to Al-Aqsa mosque at one point, and he's looking at he's prays at the mosque, and he talks to Ahmed about like the meaning of that, and how sacred these holy sites are to him, and the suffering of the people, and all of the dimensions of the conflict. Asceticism and like the ability to stoicism, right, is a major characteristic of Ibrahim. He goes to prison, he bears that. The way that the narrator and the way that Sinwar himself, the story, the author, describes all of the horrors that the Israelis are inflicting, they're very descriptive, but it's not like he's not trying to make you afraid. He's trying to tell you like these are human beings, they're doing awful things. You will suffer, but there's a line that he says multiple times where he says it was tough, but it was bearable, and don't ever break. So the security awareness comes in, where the character that actually accidentally reveals information to the Israelis ends up going to prison for longer. The Israelis love to face you with that prisoner's dilemma, right? We already know, so we want you to tell us. Well, they don't already know, and they don't know until you told them. And that's a message that Sinwar really wants his readers to know. So there's several instances where the person who talks, ends up getting it worse. It doesn't actually benefit you to spy for the Israelis, to give information to the Israelis. The book is full of technological detail. Characters carefully study the technology, the Israeli intelligence network, their spy network, the techniques they use, the hard techniques, the soft techniques, right? The way that they interrogate, the way that they build these networks up. All of that is in the book. And it's another thing, like he wants readers to use this book to think about how Israel builds that state and that apparatus of oppression, and how to begin to undo it. He's adapted to their surveillance. So just to read you a quote about the way Ibrahim, his character, understands surveillance. And this is another admiring. The narrator is describing Ibrahim in an admiring way, this quality that he has. He says, Ibrahim had a high ability to present things naturally, to conceal what was inside him, to suppress his emotions, and to disguise in a way that even his wife rarely sensed his unusual movements during his duties and roles in the Intifada activities, even though he was considered a central figure in his group bearing a significant burden. And the other thing that's like very central, it's so central to Palestinians and Palestinian life that I think it's almost invisible to them, is the centrality of education. And so the constant disruptions. I mean, the Israelis destroyed all the universities, they destroyed all the schools, they're bombing people outside of the schools. And that's, when these things happen in Sinwar's book, he says, this happens. However, the academic journey had to continue, and a feasible solution was found by converting classrooms. And so it's just it's obviously education has to go on, right? Like it's clearly education has to go on. So these are the kinds of things that I think Yahya Sinwar wanted to convey. He wanted to say that this is a good kind of person. This is a way that a good person lives their life, which is like a lot of what novels and literature are ultimately about.
And his Yahya Sinwar's son was named Ibrahim. He's also known as Abu Ibrahim.
Yeah. And his father. So
his father, right?
Yeah. So it's Yahya Ibrahim Sinwar. So
Yeah.
I think that underscores Justin's observation that this character is a stand-in for Yahya Sinwar himself.
Yeah. Justin, we're now in the second year of the Western-backed and orchestrated Israeli genocide. And Israel has expanded its mass killing from Gaza to Lebanon. You often say on your program that there's no end in sight. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be much hope of an imminent ceasefire at this point. What ideas do you see in Sinwar's writings that attempt to answer the question of how a society, a people, a resistance movement can endure amid so much horror and suffering that is deliberately inflicted on them in an effort to break their resistance, if not destroy them completely? Is the level of death and destruction that Israel has perpetrated since last October, a sign that Sinwar miscalculated, that his strategy was, a failure of some sort? Or do you, as you interpret the ideas in the book, as well as in his few but significant interviews, how do you think he would respond?
Okay, that's a great question. Let me tackle the miscalculation last, because I think we have to build up to the answer to that question. I think the answer is no. I'll spoil. I'm a spoiler. I'm big on spoilers in everything that I do, but I'll address it at length. As far as how the society resists, there's a lot in The Thorn and the Carnation about this. And he has a character. The significance of names again. He has a character named Sheikh Ahmed. No last name, but Sheikh Ahmed is this important religious leader. He sees boys playing cards, out playing cards, and he comes and he scolds them and he tells them instead of playing cards, they should be praying. He tells them to pray and read and study and work for liberation. And in fact, in the kind of sectarian history of the region, and of the Palestinian movement, there has always been, not always, but decades ago, there was a critique that Hamas didn't do enough in the Intifada and in the armed struggle, and they kind of sat it out. And they only joined later on, and they didn't coordinate with with Fatah and so on. And so this happens in the book. There's a character, a cousin of Ibrahim's, that's with Fatah, and he always wants to compromise. He always wants to make a deal, and Ibrahim is always explaining to him that there's no benefit to a deal. And that is like one of the concepts that I think Sinwar made in both interviews and in the book, that there's no benefit to agreements with Israel. He's very much like in favor of a ceasefire. In various points in the book and in his interviews especially, he talks about a ceasefire, the hudna, the long-term ceasefire, calm for calm. And he talks about it as like, but that's something you do without really an agreement. It's not a negotiation over land. It's not a negotiation over rights. It's just a ceasefire, but it could be a long ceasefire so that people could move on with their lives and get used to things and so on. He describes this, but so his cousin Mahmoud, Ibrahim's cousin, the fictional character, who wants to do Oslo, who wants to go into the Oslo Accords, and Ibrahim tells him, or Mahmoud asks Ibrahim, like, why, if the outcome is the same, why is it so important to not have an agreement with Israel? And Ibrahim says the difference between Israel leaving the West Bank and Gaza through an agreement or not. If they leave by an agreement, it means we Palestinians must adhere to certain obligations, the least of which is recognizing their right to our remaining land. If they leave without an agreement under the pressure of resistance, it means that we have committed to nothing and the door remains open to us for us to continue immediately or later when we find it appropriate. And Nasrallah has said something similar in an interview he did with after the Oslo Accords, where he said Arafat's made a mistake. He didn't need to agree to get the things that he got. And so that is like, I think that's an adaptation to Israel breaking all of its agreements. And if you look at, long run North American history of treaties with indigenous peoples, they always break the treaties. They always make an agreement. They get a whole bunch of things and they don't fulfill. The settler state doesn't fulfill their end of the bargain. And Israel, of course, is patterned on that. It's modeled on that. So an adaptation that Sinwar is trying to educate his readers about is, don't make an agreement. They don't follow them anyway. You're going to be bound by it. They're not. And you're going to disarm yourself for the future struggle. Now, the other adaptations, Sinwar wants you to understand that this is a long war. It's a multi-generational war that they're in, and that's part of why the coming of age format makes so much sense. It starts in the 60s with the childhood of Ahmed, and it ends in 2004 in a kind of an open-ended way, because that's when the book ends, with the second Intifada kind of ongoing. So Sheikh Ahmed, he says he says, I guess it's in the 70s that they're in this early stage where there's a critique that Mahmoud has of Ibrahim, where he says the Islamic resistance is not fighting as much. And so one of the youths asked Sheikh Ahmed, allow me, if there's a question I'd like you to answer, because it's frequently raised in every occasion we face. Where is the role of Islamists in national work? I mean, the resistance. Sheikh Ahmed smiled, looking around at the faces of those present, and said, we are now in a stage of education and preparation. And he began to explain the importance of education in building the future of nations and peoples aspiring to achieve noble goals. So they go through this phase of education and preparation, but then they go to an armed struggle phase. And the armed struggle phase is so difficult. It's all under massive surveillance. So much of what they do is keeping a secret. It's getting these rudimentary weapons. It's doing these really, it's going to jail. It's getting, trying to maintain your organization in the prison, hunger strikes in the prison. So all of these things are building up a resistance from nothing, building up weapons from nothing. And it goes all the way, the book goes all the way through this in a lot of detail until ultimately Oslo, when Ibrahim has to make this speech of the last lesson that I think is in the book, which is that resistance never stops. So even if you lose a war, even if your leaders betray you and make a bad agreement, it means you have to start over. It means there's a setback and you start over. He says, his character Ibrahim in jail, he kind of talks to his fellow cellmates. He says, all the sacrifices of the first Intifada have been wasted, and now with the politicians and negotiators, we've reached a deadlock. What's stopping us from starting anew? And he says hundreds of thousands of martyrs will fall, hundreds, if not thousands of martyrs will fall, tens of thousands will be wounded. You'll find someone to propose going to a new Oslo, or whatever you want to call it. Every round of our people's struggle and sacrifice, the politicians come to reap the fruits. Because they rush to harvest the fruit before its time, they are punished by being deprived of it. Neither does the fruit stay on the tree to ripen, nor is it useful when harvested, because it's not yet ripe. This was the solution with our people's first Intifada, and now we must start again until someone imagines that the fruit has ripened and its time has come, only to destroy everything our people have sacrificed for. So it's a little bit, Ibrahim gets a little fatalistic at the end for sure. But the point is, this goes on as long as it has to. And Sinwar himself said this explicitly when he came out of jail. So now to the question of did Sinwar miscalculate? I think what I want to say about that is, Israel portrays itself and the West portrays itself as this immense juggernaut, and the Palestinians, it's like swatting a fly or something, the relative power. But in fact, I would say that Israel and the West has now transformed itself completely, because they're trying to adapt to Sinwar's strategy. So Sinwar has adapted, Sinwar and Nasrallah and the resistance leaders of that generation, they adapted a whole set of strategies to defeat Israel. And Israel kind of had this choice of either accepting defeat or going completely insane and driving the West completely insane. And so that was always the calculation. And I don't think it's a miscalculation to say, well, I assume that rather than going completely insane, they're going to come to some kind of sane conclusion. But that's not what happened, and that's where we are. So I wouldn't call it a miscalculation. I would call it like this profound transformation that Western society and Israel has been willing to undertake. Specifically, like Sinwar and the resistance took prisoners to try to exchange for Israel's strategy of taking prisoners. And Israel's decided, no, we'll kill our own prisoners. We'll Hannibal our own prisoners. The resistance has tried to create this equation of rockets where they can rocket and hit targets in Israel in exchange. If Israel chooses to unleash all this destruction on them, Israel said, okay, fine, you can hit all the targets and destroy them. You can destroy our economy. Their economy is under this massive pressure. It's collapsing. And so all of these things, which I think are long-term unviabilities and long-term kind of insanities, have have been in response, and a perverse response, and the alternative to having a rational response to having your strategies defeated by your opponent, which is all described in Sinwar's kind of book and what he laid out.
Well, kind of following that thread, we, you and I, and a bunch of our colleagues and people we frequently work with, do these roundtable conversations every couple of weeks, kind of talking about the role of those of us as witnesses, to this genocide, coming from the imperial core in countries such as the U.S., Canada, France, Germany, Britain, et cetera, which are full partners in this genocide. How do we understand our role? Are we powerless? Do our views even matter? Do our protests matter? And for those of us in the U.S. right now, do our votes matter? What have we learned about these societies in the last year that we either didn't know before or that has been clarified in the last 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I learned a lot. I in a way, I think I learned a lot about how naive I was more than about how our society works. International law, nonviolence, all of these kind of things that activists took for granted, these doctrines, I think they're fraudulent. I mean, and electoralism too. Electoralism, the idea how I don't believe that choosing between one genocidal party and another does matter. But if there's a non-genocidal candidate on the ballot, even if they're, say some irritating things once in a while, I think that does matter. I think your vote does matter. I think you do have to punish genocide if you have the vote.
Yeah.
I think our views matter a lot. I think that we know, like, we have to humble ourselves, right? Like, this is not, these societies that we live in are not where the issue is going to be decided. And I don't like that kind of Western idea that like the only thing that matters is what we do or what happens here. I don't think that at all. I think that it's much more secondary, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter, because if it didn't matter, there wouldn't be all of this effort to infiltrate all of our spaces. There wouldn't be all of this effort to suppress us. Of course it matters. It matters a lot. But I mean, in terms of humbling ourselves and how to approach this, I think, the phase of education and preparation is important. Like, the situation is so bad and so urgent that the tendency would be, let's do something unstrategic. It doesn't, like, we have to vote, or like we have to vote for Kamala because it's just so bad, and harm reduction or whatever it is. But it's like the abilities we have, the capacities that we have to make change, they don't come from how bad the situation is. They come from the years of work that we put in terms of education and organization and consciousness. And again, like, if you read Sinwar's book, like, the situation that they were in when they were building their resistance is not, it's really, really amazing that they were able to do any of the things that they've done and still are. And so it's like, the ability to diagnose the society you're in, the ability to understand the nature of the opposition. I think in the West, there are still a lot of misconceptions about like whether Israel's a foreign country or not. Like Israel, the whole Western elite is unified on the question of Zionism. It's not you're not going to drive a wedge between the American or Canadian elite and Israel. That's not going to work. So there's just a whole there's a whole lot of work of education and preparation and building capacity to do things that that without that, it's like, yeah, we're desperate. It's a desperate situation and we have to do something, but it's like we don't have very many abilities to do very much, and that's what we have to think about and we have to work on. The other thing people, I wish more people would understand still, and our listeners here don't have this problem, but like Palestine, for many decades, people like us, we were fringe people. We were like, oh, the Palestine people, like, oh, you're the Palestine people, like this is this fringe thing going on with these Palestine people who follow this foreign conflict. And it's like, this is the central issue of our time. Like, this is the central issue right now in every country in the world. This is more important than climate change. This is the most important issue right now. And it reaches every corner of Western society through the Western elite, which is 100% committed to the genocide and to Israel. And so if like understanding that the scale of this and the size of this task is definitely a first step to like Mike said in one of our therapy sessions, he said, people call us a single issue voter, but this is a single issue empire. Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so those are some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of.
Yeah. I mean, Palestine is so interlaced in everything that we confront here in the imperial core, for sure.
Justin, let's talk now more about Israel itself.
Mm-hmm.
20 years ago, an Israeli professor called Arnon Sofer, who was an advisor to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon at the time, gave an extraordinary interview in the Jerusalem Post. The main thrust of his argument was to advocate for Israel's separation from Gaza. What actually happened in 2005 is the so-called Gaza disengagement. Israel withdrew its soldiers and settlers from inside Gaza and instead placed the territory under an ever-tightening siege from land, sea, and air. And with increasing frequency, Israel launched massive attacks on Gaza, destroying infrastructure and massacring civilians, a process it calls mowing the lawn. This is the policy that Sofer supported. But here's what he said in that 2004 interview, and brace yourself for anyone who hasn't heard this before. And he's talking about what would happen after that Gaza disengagement in 2005. He says, quote, "We will tell the Palestinians that if a single missile is fired over the fence, we will fire 10 in response, and women and children will be killed and houses will be destroyed. Further down the line, when 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will be even bigger animals than they are today, with the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam. The pressure at the border will be awful. It's going to be a terrible war. So if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day." And now, if that isn't horrifying enough, this is what Arnon Sofer added. "If we don't kill, we will cease to exist. The only thing that concerns me is how to ensure that the boys and men who are going to have to do the killing will be able to return home to their families and be normal human beings." That was printed in the Jerusalem Post in 2004. Justin, can you talk about what you see happening in Israeli society? What happens to a society that perpetrates a genocide like this relentlessly and without remorse? Can those carrying out this crime indeed be normal human beings? What do you see happening in Israel, and what do you predict may happen in year 2 of this genocide? Is there any hope that internal factors will help end the genocide?
Yeah, this is something I've been watching since the beginning, and something specifically I've been watching the Israeli military for signs of collapse, of morale collapse. And there were articles that came out just this week about this, several. I mean, the CNN story you guys probably saw. I don't think you talked about it, Nora. But the CNN story about this poor bulldozer operator who said he bulldozed hundreds of people, and how the main conclusion from this is that he can't eat meat anymore. And what I thought was interesting was, though, like, even in this kind of this thing where they're discussing their trauma, and they're discussing how difficult it is to do all these horrific acts, they talk about it in terms of what I saw in Gaza, what I saw in Gaza, not what I did in Gaza. And what that tells me is that there's still like a level of inability to say what's really going on. And when you can't say what's really going on, even when you're being really blunt, even when you're like this guy that you just quoted, where he says we're going to have to kill and kill, um, he's being really blunt, but he's not actually saying what's really going on, because he's not, there's a certain if you study psychology, like the way people project things onto others, or the way that they accidentally reveal things that they are trying to suppress, he's not worried about Palestinians being big animals. He's worried about the fact that Israelis are becoming insane and fanatical. All of those words that he's talking about Gaza, he's actually worried, and he says that it's not long between him saying that he's worried about Palestinian animals and then saying he's actually worried about whether the killers can become normal human beings. That's like, it's just a few words that separate that. What he's really concerned about is that all the whole time. And likewise, they're not able to talk about the fact that they're doing it. So it's too painful for them to say, I'm doing these acts. So they have to say, I saw these acts. And it's painful to see these acts. But like, as long as you're denying what you're actually doing, you're not getting anywhere in terms of psychological insight or mental health. And there was another piece, or maybe it was the same piece, but they talked to a therapist, and the therapist said, the Israeli therapist said, he's a military therapist, and um, he said, well, when they tell me how hard it is to see what they saw, I try to normalize it. I try to remind them of their values. I try to remind them why they would why they would want to go to Gaza in the first place. And so the therapist is trying to normalize something, trying to normalize mass murder and genocide. Well, that's not, that doesn't work. It's, no matter how scientifically speaking, it's not normal. For most people, it's not normal. So there's going to be a number of psychopaths in every society that gets off on it and is bloodlust. Most of the people are pretending to, I think. And so there is going to be some kind of collapse, even if they can't, and if they can't admit even that they're doing it, the collapse will come in other ways. They'll kill themselves, they'll commit abuses, they won't. And my thinking was, and continues to be, at some point they're also not going to follow orders, because there are orders. If you have the right to kill whoever you feel like, I don't know that that's going to translate to the military discipline to make sacrifices to that are necessary to fight a war and win a military conflict. So I still believe that a military collapse is a possibility, just from this. And there are a few instances in history that we can look to, even the Vietnam War, drugs, veteran suicides, attacking officers, mutinies. All of these things can happen in a war that is so pointless, and the increasingly, like, the existence of the whole state is pointless. And the Hannibal doctrine tells you that your comrades will kill you if you're at risk of getting captured. These are all kind of unusual. I've called it before a social experiment. And we don't know how the social experiment will ultimately shape up. But the economy is not viable. Your comrades will kill you. You're committing atrocities. You're not allowed to say why. You're going crazy. You don't know why. And in addition, every once in a while, the resistance is blowing you up in your tank, or killing your senior officers, or rocketing you where you're trying to gather, sniping you where you are. So all of these things are combining, I think, to put a lot of pressure that Israel will never admit is on these soldiers. And I do think that is a possibility in the year 2 or year 3, that will have them. It can't. I just don't see how logically that can have no military consequences.
What? Just a quick follow-up on that, Justin. What do you think of the what the Israelis are doing is so depraved, and if there are people who oppose it, they're completely silent. I mean, you could maybe fill a phone booth with them if they exist. Some viewers may not know what a phone booth is, but at the same time, what's at stake for CNN or the New York Times or the CBC to continue to whitewash these atrocities? I mean, is it just that they're part of the same state propaganda apparatus, or is there what's your psychological reading of that, if there is one?
Yeah, my psychological reading of that is basically that it's racism. And racism has to also constantly be stoked. It has to constantly be taught, and it has to be retaught. And I think that there's a lot of that in all of these Western countries. So in Canada, like, pro-Israel organizations are always like have special programs in the school boards here. So they want to go in and, it's like, of course, we want to teach about World War II, and we want to teach about the Holocaust and so on. But they want to make sure that it's taught in a pro-Israel way, right? Like, they want to make sure that it's taught in this very specific way to young people. I read Elie Wiesel in high school as one of my high school readings in like high school literature class or something. And I didn't even know Elie Wiesel was radically pro-Israel, or that there were even things that weren't true in that book that he wrote. And so that is a key part of what happens in Western countries. It's, we've called it like it is. You guys call it that. Very few people call it what it is, but it's anti-Palestinian racism. It's a very specific. It's not the same as Islamophobia. It's not the same. It's a very specific pro-Israel program of racism. And so they are the media institutions of all of these countries are ideologically bound to that program, and also organizationally always reminded of that by the strong lobbies and editors that that have these mechanisms for punishing reporters and getting them fired. And lots of reporters have been fired in the West, in Canada, disciplined or fired, and they have very strong directives and specific directives. What's at stake? I mean, yeah, it's the way that it's one of the guiding ideologies of the society. It's hard to what's at stake is like potentially changing some really major plank of the ideological basis of Western societies.
Yeah. We have a long way to go. Finally, Justin, your own novel, Siege Breakers, is fundamentally optimistic to the extent that it imagines a future liberated Palestine. Compared with when you published it way back, it seems like a century ago in 2019. Do you find it more or less difficult to envision liberation? And what role do such imaginative exercises like writing a novel play?
I find it way easier to imagine. So the whole point of that writing that novel was to kind of break a taboo. Like what I was trying to break, you guys, it sounds so funny that this was a taboo. I was trying to break the taboo that the Palestinian armed resistance could be the good guys. That was the thing. I was like, I'm gonna portray resistance fighters as if they're the good guys and as if
For
they're
a
action
Western
heroes.
audience. Yeah.
Yeah, for a
Yeah.
Western, as if they're the action heroes, as if they're like doing like cool action stuff because it's a thriller novel. And there are, non-Palestinian characters, but the main character is this guy who's basically a Qassam squad, and he's doing all kinds of thriller type things that were done up until that point. So most of what I took was like from the 2014 war, and I mean it was mainly written during, it was outlined and written during the 2014 war, when I thought like, okay, imagine if this, imagine the next war, which would be like the one they would actually break the siege at the end of it. And so that was like the taboo. Everybody knows that they're the good guys now. I mean, not everybody, but like, it's not a taboo anymore. We've watched them do this thing that I was trying to show. So that's, that taboo is broken. You don't need to read I shouldn't say this. You don't need to read Siege Breakers anymore.
It's really good. People should read it.
And we have an interview with you from 2019.
Oh, that's right.
With Nora interviewed you for the Electronic Intifada podcast, which I listened to last night, and it's still a really good listen. So.
Back when both of us had no gray hair, right?
Yeah, so it's way easier. And that book, I didn't have any Houthis. There's no Houthis in Yemen that are like joining the fight. There's no massive attack from Iran. I put like I had a very there's no character that's from Lebanon. There's no Hizballah character. There's like oblique references to maybe they were helping or something. Like I didn't want to leave them out of the picture, but it's like this is a much bigger global battle, and the Palestinians have much bigger and stronger allies than I imagined in Siege Breakers. It's true that I didn't imagine the depravity of Israel. I had the Israeli villains in the book are rational. They're what I think of like very calculating, very clever. They know the Palestinians, and so they're kind of trying to get to the bottom of what's happening and how so much resistance was built up under their noses. And that's like the villain's journey in that book. I did not see this coming, as the young people like to say, in terms of the depravity of what Israel has done. And so those are the two things that I have said this before. If I had written in 2019 what Israel is doing now, my book would have been seen as a unbelievably anti-Semitic smear book, because it's unbelievable how it would have been. How could I have imagined? What kind of person would I be if I imagined this stuff happening? So yeah, it's beyond the human ability to imagine or project, and for that reason I don't even feel bad that I wasn't able to project it.
It's there is an extraordinary transformation. I mean, just the discussion we had today. Think about those. I mentioned the statements that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Justin Trudeau and Keir Starmer put up on social media, and the social media response to them was literally tens of thousands of people saying, "You're not going to tell us how to think." There were thousands of replies saying, Yahya Sinwar is a hero. You are the criminal. I mean, it's amazing when I think back to post 9/11. I don't, we didn't have social media in the same way, but still, nobody would have had I think people were too intimidated to say the kinds of things they say today that they may have felt. I'm not, of course, comparing the 9/11 attacks with, but in terms of questioning official narratives,
Yeah.
in terms of asking the basic questions like why would something like 9/11 happen? Who are the people who are supposedly behind it in terms of like the dirty wars the US was fighting in Afghanistan? You couldn't even ask those questions. And now people are just, they have no time for the bullshit.
Yeah.
And I think that is a massive transformation that is not reflected in our official government media, whether it's the CBC or the BBC or the New York Times or CNN, a semi-official media. But people no longer, it's this is why people hate them so much and don't trust them, because they know they're being lied to.
Yeah.
Justin, I could listen to you all day. I love listening to you. And for those who want to hear more of you, they can do so, because you have a really fascinating YouTube channel, which I listen to and watch all the time, called the Anti-Empire Project. And you do regular sit reps about Gaza, about Lebanon, about the regional situation, where you have just incredibly interesting insights. You write on your own Substack. Now you write at the Electronic Intifada
That's right.
too. I was shocked that was your first article. Why hadn't you been writing for us for years?
Who knows?
But you're welcome to do so. And I hope you'll come back and talk to us again soon.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Justin.
Justin.